Welcome. Mother's Day is coming up. We love moms, right? Moms are great. For my mom this year, I made her a cutting board. This is the first cutting board I've ever made. It's end grain. It's made out of sapele and maple. I used offcuts that I used previously, and I think it turned out pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's my mom, and she's gonna love it. So there's plenty of time left if you want to make one for your mom too, so follow along and maybe you can make one for a mom in your life. So like I said, using maple and sapele. Here's the maple. You can see it's basically a giant banana. So my hope is that I can cut it down into smaller pieces and then get something useful out of it. At the far end there, you can see the sapele. These are just some pieces that I got from a local lumber supplier. They were nice enough to give them to me for free. So to start with, I had to cross-cut everything. So I used my little cross-cut sled for my job site saw. Set my stop block using these shorter sapele pieces as a reference, and then I started cutting down the maple. Then it was time to rip everything down into strips. So before long I had these strips cut down to roughly equal lengths and more or less equal widths, and as you can see I arranged them in this mostly symmetrical pattern that looks kind of nice. One important thing about this is you want to have asymmetry on either side. So you see I have one sapele strip like right here, and on the other side it's maple. And when you do that, whenever you rearrange your boards, you will have a nice alternating pattern you will see later on in the video. And then it was time to glue up these strips. I used Titebond 3 because it's water resistant or waterproof, and it's also indirect contact food safe, so as good as you can get for a glue for a cutting board. I don't know about you guys, but I always leave the cap open on my glue, and then every time I use it I have to get rid of that giant clump that gets trapped in the nozzle before I can even get any of it out. Then it was my favorite part where I get to rub the glue off my hands. Nice and satisfying. And I used a caul, so it was just not really a caul I guess, just a jointed wooden board. Try to line up everything straight on one side. That way when I clamp it up I can avoid waste on the ends as much as possible. So as you can see, you get a good bit of squeeze out here, and that's what you're looking for to get these nice solid joints. Then I wiped it down with a wet shop towel. You could do that, or you could let it tack up for about an hour and scrape it with a paint scraper or old chisel or something like that. What you don't want to do is let it harden up completely, because then it makes it really hard to get off. As you can see, I had some little gaps, bowed up areas, because this wood was all still pretty poorly jointed. And so I used some F-style and squeeze clamps just to straighten those out. So I left it in clamps overnight, came back the next day. Glue should be nice and hard at this point. You want to let it cure overnight, in my opinion. I watched a video by Woodcraft by Suman, another YouTube channel, highly recommend. He does a lot of quasi, at least scientific studies with woodworking techniques, and it really seems that you need to leave glue to set up overnight for it to be most effective. And being that this is a cutting board and the glue is all that's holding these joints together, I think it's especially important. Then, while my wife was taking our baby and dog out for a stroll, I broke out the planer and I cleaned up both faces just with some skip planing. I'm not really supposed to use this inside because of the smell and the dust, but I won't tell her if you won't. Unless she watches this video, I suppose, which she definitely will. So this is what you end up with. Just skip planing, no joiner involved, and it's really pretty flat. Not too bad at all. Then it's back to the table saw. I have this Incra Miter Express, which is just a fancy sort of crosscut sled, and I cut a square edge on one end. And I set up a stop block to determine the final height of the cutting board, which is a little bit weird the way it's oriented now, but ultimately these are all going to stand on their ends, so whatever width of strips I cut now is going to be how tall the final board is. After that first cut, I noticed that the miter bar was a little bit tight, so I loosened it up with an Allen key. It's one very nice thing about Incra miter bars is they're adjustable from the top, so you can get the perfect fit and make sure there's no slop, but also that it runs smoothly. So before long I had another bunch of strips, just taller this time, and as I was going every other strip I would flip end over end to create a nice little alternating pattern. Before too long it was really starting to look like a pretty cool little end grain cutting board. Then it was time for another glue up, which means, you guessed it, having to pull the glue out of the nozzle of the glue bottle again because I left it open. This time I needed a pair of pliers just to get the nozzle off. As you can see here, I thought I'd get smart and use the flat surface of the table with a silicone mat and just kind of clamp it from the sides with these big K-body clamps. It ended up working okay, but honestly I would just do a regular glue up like I did the first time. Could I go back? Not much of a difference. So here was where this glue up got really challenging. Because of the pattern, I had to line up all these squares corner to corner, and it became really difficult to do that and maintain a flat face on both sides and avoid any sort of gaps. So I clamped and unclamped over and over. I stared at it, I moved things around. I used this F-style clamp to try to rack everything into position. It kept coming apart again. I was losing the things that I had already tried to do. So I ended up kind of getting it good enough and just calling it okay. I had to remind myself, this is for my mom, and she's gonna love it, even if some of the corners don't perfectly meet up. Once again, let it dry overnight and pulled it out of clamps, and here's what we ended up with. So you can see there's still a decent amount of glue, but I got a lot of it with that wet shop towel. But if you look closely, you can see some of the corners not aligning exactly as I wanted them to. Not a huge deal. Don't think anyone's really going to care. It's time to try to flatten the faces. So to do this, I ended up using a sander and a card scraper. Started out just thinking maybe I can just throw 80 grit sandpaper on here, turn it all the way up, and just sand the whole thing flat. Because it's end grain, it takes forever with the sander to cut because it's so strong in that orientation. On the other hand, if I was to try to skip plane it like this, just like I did the first time, it would potentially explode because the cutter heads would have such a hard time on the end grain as well. You can actually use a planer for end grain cutting boards like this to get them flat, but I really wanted to avoid the snipe, and I also was feeling too lazy to create any sort of like end boards to be sacrificial for that snipe, but that is definitely a possibility. Could I go back and do this again? I would have done that because this ended up taking forever. If you want to know more about how to do that, Scott Walsh, another YouTube woodworking person, just recently did a video about that, and he was pretty thorough. But anyway, here's past me doing his best with sanding evenly, creating grid line patterns with a pencil every time so that I wasn't getting any dips or valleys, and I found out about halfway through doing this that it is literally a grid pattern already, and I really didn't need to draw pencil lines because I could just follow the grid and go at a natural pace, but here I was doing it anyway. So after an absurd amount of sanding, this is what I ended up with on this side. As you may be able to see, there are some little bug tracks that were sanded down into with the Sapele. I thought about filling them with some CA glue or something, but then I just ended up leaving them. They look fine. So after sanding all the way down on one side, I got really tired of sanding and I thought I'd try this little card scraper on for size. And it actually worked way faster, way better. Definitely see what all the fuss is about with the card scraper for finish prep. I'll say for a long time I was intimidated by card scrapers, but then I got this Rockler sharpening jig and it makes it a lot easier to sharpen. That's kind of the challenging part. I know some people can get such a sharp edge, they can actually go straight from the card scraper to applying finish, but I am not one of those people, so I had to finish with some sanding again. Then it was back to the table saw to get a nice little edge on everything, so this way I didn't have to sand the sides as much as I did the faces. I could just cut that burnt edge off, along with any of those inconsistencies with the glue up. And it was time to add some little handles, so for this I'm just using my little router table here. This thing's actually pretty nice. It's from Rockler. I think it was about 70 bucks if I'm not mistaken, and basically just clamp it to a work surface, put your router in it, and you're good to go, and it gets you most of the functionality that a normal sized router table would provide. Here you can see me setting it up. I ended up setting up some stop blocks on either side to stop the cut so that the handles were symmetrical and centered. So now that I had a stop block on either side, I dropped my cutting board down onto the bit. This first cut I messed up a little bit because the fence was pretty short and I accidentally tipped the cutting board back. But luckily I did this in multiple passes, and with subsequent passes I was able to clean that up because it widened the cut a bit. So here it is on one side. And here it is on the other side. And I just kept going until I got the depth that I was looking for that felt nice to the fingers. You can see in the end, even though it was a brand new router bit, I did get some burning in its maple. Maple just really loves to burn, and basically once the bit stopped in the cut on the ends, it burned even though I was fast about it. Next I used the same router table with a little round over bit and rounded over all the edges. You could do this just with the handheld router and not using the router table, but while I had this set up, I like using the router table better than using the router by hand. I find that I have less room for error this way. Here I thought I'd include a little snippet of the joys of not having a workshop. This is me breaking everything down that I had gotten out. I have a tendency to just get everything out and procrastinate cleaning up as I go. And before too long, I have solid 5 to 10 minutes of just packing everything away and putting it back in its place. Small price to pay. This, by the way, is at 8x speed, to give you an idea. And it was time for some sanding. Here's me having a good time sanding those little handles that were so burned. I ended up just giving up at some point. So as I was starting the sanding process, I realized I had a little bit of a twist in the board, which is not good for a cutting board, I imagine. Just having cutting boards in the past that have had twists or cups, bows, really unpleasant to use. You really want it to be as flat as possible. So took a little bit of extra time, used a combination square, checking for flatness, marking any high spots, then used this jack plane to go ahead and plane those high spots down and get it as flat as I could. You can see that I'm planing from the end to the center and not going past the center or going all the way across to the other end, because this is end grain. It's really prone to tear out, so if I was to just plane all the way end to end, I would blow out the back end. So here you can see me open mouth checking for flatness, and before long I had it pretty dang flat. Not perfect, but good enough. At that point it was time for finish sanding. So this is what you might call some serious sanding. I went 80, 120, 150, 180, all the way up to 220 grits, really taking my time through the grits, marking with a grid, with a pencil, making sure I'm not spending too much time in one area or neglecting other areas. Just really leaning into the process, and sanding. This probably took a couple hours total, but worth doing to get that nice smooth finish. So while you watch me painstakingly sand this project, I figure now's a good time to ask you for your support. If you could like and subscribe this video, I would really appreciate it. This is my first ever YouTube video on this channel, and well, period. And I would love to do more of these. I'm a no wood shop woodworker. My shop is outside and I have one workbench in my living room. I would love to have a shop someday, but for the foreseeable future, that's not going to happen. So if you want to see how I managed to do all sorts of woodworking projects without having a workshop, and hopefully make it seem like something that's maybe a little bit more approachable to get into as a hobby if you don't have a space for a workshop, but could do something like what I'm doing, then like and subscribe, and I'll keep making videos and show you how I do it. So I did end up water popping the grain on this after I finished sanding up to 220. This is just to kind of raise the wood fibers, and then I'll be able to knock down any kind of fuzziness that would otherwise pop through the finish once you use the cutting board and wash it for the first time. So just sprayed it with water, let it dry in the sun, and came back with some 220 grit sandpaper to knock those fuzzies down. Then before applying finish, I just cleaned it real thoroughly with some mineral spirits, just to get rid of any residual sawdust that was kind of deeper in the wood grain. Let it dry in the sun, and then it was time to apply some finish. So for the finish, I'm using this pure tung oil by Walrus Oil. They also make a cutting board oil, but this is just the tung oil. So it's no VOCs, it's food safe, pretty easy to apply. You just kind of rub it on and then wipe off the excess. Some of these manufacturers recommend flood coating, really like soaking it, but I'm using this approach that's recommended by The Wood Whisperer, another YouTuber, Mark Spagnolo. Just says basically to apply a thin coat and just give it that wet look, and then similarly wipe off the excess. But this way you really conserve a lot of finish, but you still end up with a durable end product. So after 3 coats, waiting 24 hours between coats, this project's ready for the big reveal. So that's it. That's how you make a cutting board. This thing turned out pretty good. It's really smooth. I'm having a hard time not touching it, actually. So I'm gonna have to make one for myself at some point, because I'm gonna give this to my mom and I'm gonna miss rubbing it. So anyway, if you like this video, like and subscribe. It's a new channel. I could really use the support, and I really appreciate you watching. I'll see you next time. Oh, by the way, next time I'll show you how to make this table. Thanks.